Good afternoon, and welcome to the Canadian Housing and Renewal Association's Canadian Rental Housing Index webinar. I'm Dominika Krzeminska, Director of Programs and Strategic Initiatives at CRHI, and I will be your host for today's webinar. Thank you all for joining us. Before we begin, I'll give a brief overview of the webinar technology and then introduce our agenda and speaker for this afternoon's presentation. Today's webinar is in real time. You should now be able to see a title screen of today's presentation, and you should be able to hear me over your computer speakers, headset, or through your telephone if you've chosen to dial in. You're currently all muted. We do this to minimize background noise. If you wish to ask questions, which we encourage you to do, you may type your question into the question dialog box on the webinar control panel at any time during the presentation. We will address your questions throughout the webinar. So be sure to, if you think of a question, just type it in. We'll get to it. As this webinar includes a live demonstration of an online tool, we are at the mercy of internet speeds. And so we apologize in advance for any lags that occur during the demonstration. If at any point you're having problems with the technology, please send a message to Emily Sartoretto in the chat box on the webinar control panel. Moving on to today's webinar topic. In May of 2018, BC Nonprofit Housing Association and partners from across Canada released a major update to the Canadian Rental Housing Index. The index is an interactive web map and Canada's most comprehensive database of rental housing statistics, providing information on affordability and overcrowding for over 800 municipalities and regions across the country. The goal of the index is to inform long-term planning, policy development, research, and decision-making for Canada's affordable rental housing sector. In today's webinar, Brian Clifford of BCNPHA will provide an overview of the index and its history. He'll do a live demonstration of how to use the tool and provide examples of how the index has been used in practice. I now have the pleasure of introducing to you our speaker for today. Brian Clifford is a policy manager at BC Nonprofit Housing Association. His background is in affordable housing research and policy analysis, and he has led various projects such as BCNPHA's Canadian Rental Housing Index, Housing Central's An Affordable Housing Plan for BC, and Activity 1 of Metro Vancouver's Transit-Oriented Affordable Housing Study. He holds a master's degree in urban studies from Simon Fraser. And now over to you, Brian.
Great, thanks Dominika, and just a big thanks to CRHI for having me today. So I want to begin just by recognizing our partners on the project. We had a broad range of stakeholders from across Canada provide extensive financial and in-kind support, and we could not have undertaken the project without them. So, in many ways, this was a project by Canada's community housing sector, so big thanks. Okay, so just as a bit of an overview for what I'm going to be discussing today, I'm going to provide a bit of a background and a context into the index. I'm going to provide a walkthrough of the site, look at how the index is being used in practice, and then talk very briefly about some of the updates we have planned. Okay, so as Dominika kind of mentioned, I just wanted to throw out what the index is. So basically, it's an interactive data tool that provides detailed information on incomes, rents, affordability, and overcrowding for renter households. All the information contained in the index is based on the 2016 census. And it provides infographics and comparison tools, detailed maps and data tables for over 800 communities in Canada. So I'm just going to take a few moments to discuss why we developed the index in the first place. The original impetus was that there was a large data gap in the rental housing sector. When we looked around when we were first developing the index in 2013 and 14, there were all these interesting data tools and indices that measured affordability of ownership housing, but not anything similar for the rental sector. So while we knew that there was a lot of affordability problems for renters, the conversation tended to take a back seat to the problems facing owners. So we wanted to develop a similar tool to highlight the affordability issues in the rental sector. Furthermore, the CMHC, while they provide a lot of information on the rental housing market in Canada, most of the information is limited to the purpose-built segment of the market. Over the last 20 to 30 years, secondary rental housing in the form of rented houses, basement suites, and condos have become an important part of the rental market. And we see jurisdictions that this can account for between 40 and 60% of the stock in some communities. So while the CMHC, they provide secondary and condo market surveys to capture these changes, their surveys are limited to large urban centers. So we wanted to use census data to capture the entirety of the rental market, as census data is self-reported by households and captures all forms of rental housing. So whether you're living in a condo or rented home, you fill out the survey and mark that you're a renter. It's not limited to purpose-built rental. So as the right of my slide indicates, there were many questions out there for the rental sector. You know, how much do renters earn? Are renters overcrowded? Does my community need more rental housing? How much are renters spending on housing? And we lacked a standardized and consistent data set for large and small communities alike. And in addition, we didn't have that in an easy-to-use, free, and accessible platform. And so we decided to fill that gap. And so a bit of a motto at BCNPHA also is that what gets measured gets done. And we wanted to take a stab at measuring the baseline affordability for renters, articulating through evidence that there was a problem, and then working as a community to find appropriate solutions. So just to talk a little bit about the genesis of the newest update, we originally launched the project in November 2014 for BC only. We partnered with Van City Credit Union at that time and went through the process of constructing the first site using a custom data request based on the 2011 National Household Survey, or 2011 census. Out of the launch, we received positive response from the media, as well as a lot of positive response within staff in municipalities, nonprofit organizations, researchers, policy analysts, et cetera. So given that positive response, we released a national version of the index in 2015, which increased the coverage of the communities that we covered from about 80 communities to over 800 communities nationally. So that version, though, was still based on the 2011 census. And so with the release of the 2016 census data and the housing data in October 2017, a new update was required. So we decided at that point to develop new features as well as update the look and feel of the site. And so this included rebuilding the entire site in Tableau software. So as I'll demonstrate with my walkthrough, some of the new features that we wanted to include with the update were to make it customizable. So you can use the data to create customizable infographic and resources for the specific communities within the index. We wanted it to be comparable. So we wanted to develop a feature where you could compare many different jurisdictions at the same time. And finally, shareable. We wanted it to be available on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and be able to share it with social media. Okay, so with that, I'm going to jump into a bit of a walkthrough of the site. And I'm just going to switch my screens here. Okay, so this is the index site, the homepage. So the homepage, it shows the three different aspects of the rental housing index that the user can navigate to. These are the community profile, which provides high-level information about rental housing in communities, rental housing data, which provides detailed rental housing statistics, and the rental housing index, which provides the methodology for measuring the health of the rental system. So I'm going to review each one of these in turn, and then take a few minutes to discuss some of the additional features contained in the site. Before jumping in, though, I just want to note that there is a French version of the site available. Just by clicking this top right corner, it will translate everything. I'm obviously not going to be doing that today, but wanted to flag it for our French users. I also just want to emphasize that the data that we're looking at today will all be derived from the 2016 census. We do have 2011 data available, and I will show you at the end how to access that. Okay, so the first component of the site is the community profile. So there are two components to this aspect of the site. And I should mention, because we're sharing the site right now, there might be some lag, as Domenico was mentioning before, so please be patient. So the first component of the site is the community profile, and the two components here are the snapshot and the comparison tool. Our aim with the snapshot is to allow users to develop easy-to-use infographics that provide a high-level overview of the rental housing situation in particular communities. This function is great for advocacy purposes, for including in reports, or getting an at-a-glance understanding of the rental housing situation in a given community. To begin, you select the level of geography you want to see data for. You are able to view information for municipalities, for regional districts, or provinces and territories. So simply click the geography you're wishing to view information for, and it'll change step 2 right here. So we'll click Toronto as an example. So we'll begin by selecting Ontario. And then we can see all the different municipalities within Ontario that we have data for. And this will bring up a nice looking infographic that provides high level information about the rental housing situation. So it'll provide a breakdown of households by renters and owners, average and median incomes compared to the provincial total, or the provincial median and average, the average proportion of income spent on rent and utilities, average monthly rent and utility cost, households living in overcrowded conditions, as well as households spending over 30 and 50% of their income on rent and utilities. Another feature that we developed with this is that it's all downloadable. So you're able to actually download the visual, create a PDF, and that'll bring up a nice looking infographic that you can use for either reports or like I was saying before, advocacy materials. You're also able to share that visual, so you can share it to either Facebook or Twitter simply by clicking that, and it will bring up a function to allow to tweet the particular infographic that you're looking at. Okay, so that is the snapshot function of the community profile. I want to move now to the comparison tool. So we wanted to include this feature to compare many different jurisdictions at the same time. So again, you can select between municipalities, regional districts, provinces, and territories. And then you can compare 4 different indicators around average and median incomes, average rents, households spending over 30 and 50% of their income, as well as households living in overcrowded conditions. So using Saskatchewan as an example, we can click many different jurisdictions at the same time, and it will bring up our data in a nice infographic like that. You are then able to download the visual as well as share it onto social media. Okay, so now I'm going to jump into the detailed housing statistics. And first, I will start with renter households. So this shows how many renter households are in each community. To navigate the table, it's similar to before. You select between municipalities, regional districts, and provinces and territories. And then you follow the steps to select the specific geographies you want to see data for. In this example, we have it defaulted to British Columbia, but we will also select Alberta. You then select the municipalities you want to see data for. We'll include Calgary for this purpose. And what this does is it brings up a detailed table showing renter households. So for all the data tables within this component of the website in the rental housing data, we break down the analysis by 4 equal income quarters, as well as bedroom size. And so this provides a nuanced view of where renter households are situated. So how to read the table? If you're reading from left to right, it'll show you the province, then the municipality name. Next, it shows the household income range for the particular income quartile, as well as the average income for that particular income quartile. Moving over, you can see the different bedroom sizes. The row over here will summarize the totals for the income quartile. The row on the bottom will summarize for the different bedroom sizes. This figure right here is the total number of renter households for the community overall. So reading this table, we can see that in Calgary, in the first income quartile, there are 32,915 renter households who earn between 0 and 34,000 and have an average income of 20,150. If you ever want to reset the visual, simply click reset and it will bring it back to the default. Okay, so the next section I'm going to review is cost. Give it a second to load. And this map displays the average cost of rent and utilities in communities throughout the country. So to begin, you select which geography you'd like to see the map, so between municipalities, regional districts, or provinces and territories. And then you're able to zoom into the map and click on a jurisdiction. Or you're able to use the search function. For this example, I'll look up Montreal. Clicking on the jurisdiction will give you a detailed data table at the bottom. So as we saw with the last table, everything is broken out according to income quartiles, as well as bedroom size. And you're able to go through and get a very nuanced picture of what the different cost of rent and utilities are for the different components of the table. If you want to compare many different jurisdictions at the same time, you simply hold Control. And it'll bring up the different communities that you're trying to compare. So you can easily look at the different cost of rent for different jurisdictions. Again, all of this is downloadable as well as shareable on social media. Okay, so the next indicator I'm going to talk about is affordability. This measures the average proportion of income renter households spend on rent and utilities. For this map, we've laid things out slightly different than the last one. You're able to filter the map according to income quarters. The first setting shows the poorest quarter of renters, which highlights the extensive affordability pressures this income group faces throughout Canada. As you move up the income distribution, you can see how affordability pressures dissipate. We wanted to emphasize visually how affordability problems are clustered in the bottom two income quarters with this map. The map, though, it does function in the same way to the previous one. You are able to click on particular communities to bring up the detailed table below. And we have a reminder text here to remind you what you are looking at. And this is the average proportion of income spent on rent and utilities, broken out by income quarters and bedroom size. One thing I wanted to highlight with this as well is that this really, if you look at the community score overall, it doesn't seem like there's much of an affordability issue for the Cariboo or any other given community. On average, renter households spend 18% of their income on housing costs, but really the problems are clustered in the bottom or in the top two income quarters. So you can see that in the first income quarter, on average, renter households are spending 52% of their income on rent and utilities. Okay, so the next indicator I'm going to talk about is overspending. This measures renter households spending half of their gross income or more on shelter costs. So while the traditional measure of affordability is spending over 30% of gross income on shelter, we decided to use the 50% measure because we reasoned that few households would choose to spend half of their gross income on rent. And so it shows the most dire need. We also saw some resources using the 50% measure as an indicator of homelessness. So the map is laid out the same way as before, with the first selector showing the poorest income quartile. One slight variation on this map, though, is that you can filter to view both proportion and number of renter households spending 50% or more. So again, we'll choose Cariboo. And from here, you can choose either the number of households or the proportion of households. Okay, so the next indicator that I'm going to discuss is the income gap. The income gap is another affordability indicator. It measures how much additional income a household would need annually to make rent affordable. So we developed this indicator to show the affordability picture in another light. Essentially, it asks how much a household would need as a raise in their earnings to make rent affordable. Again, the map is laid out in the same way as before and can be selected between the additional amount of income required. We'll select some random jurisdictions down here. It can be seen as an amount of additional income required to make rent affordable, or as a percentage of the income being earned. So you can see that there are significant problems, again, with the first and second income quartile. Okay, so what I've been reviewing mostly are affordability indicators. I'm now going to jump into our overcrowding indicator, which is a proxy for supply. So this indicator measures renter households who are living in units that are not suitable for their household composition and size, based on the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation's National Occupancy Standard. The National Occupancy Standard examines whether a household is suitable based on its family composition and size. So as an example, two unrelated single adults living in a studio would be considered unsuitable with a one-bedroom shortfall, because the studio is only fit for one person. If the same studio were occupied by a couple, though, the household would not be considered unsuitable. So it's based on that family relation. So the overcrowding indicator looks at the number and proportion of households living in unsuitable or overcrowded conditions. The map is laid out again, similar to before. You're able to click on and obtain the data table down here. And we do see extensive overcrowding in northern communities, as the red highlights here. Okay, so finally, I'm going to look at the bedroom shortfall. So this measures the minimum amount of bedrooms that are required to house renters suitably. The indicator is, again, derived from the suitability standard. And as I noted in my example with the overcrowding indicator, our data provides us with an understanding of how much of a bedroom shortfall there exists in an overcrowded unit. So 2 singles living in a studio would yield a 1-bedroom shortfall. 3 singles living in a studio would yield a 2-bedroom shortfall, and so on. So this indicator calculates the total shortfall as a proxy for how much supply is required in a particular community. So we display the indicator by income quartiles and bedroom size only. Given that is how the data was arranged, we could only provide community-wide totals. Okay, so that's all the indicators that kind of comprise the index. I'm going to move on to the rental index component of the site now. So this page shows our methodology for measuring the health of rental housing. So the methodology is quite complex, and I won't be doing a deep dive into it today. But essentially, it takes 5 of the indicators above around affordability, overspending, income gap, overcrowding, and bedroom shortfall, and develops a score out of 10 for each indicator for each community. We then sum the scores from the 5 indicators to create a total score out of 50 for each community. Higher scores represent worse health, lower scores represent better health. We run the scores to see how communities stack up against one another provincially as well as nationally. So you are able to see how communities compare to others on a national level as well as provincial level. So if we want to see, for instance, how Ontario ranks on a national level, we simply click onto Ontario, and if you hover over, it will show the particular scores in our index. Okay, so with that, I'm just going to take a few moments to discuss some of the additional features on the website as well. First, I just would like to show you that we do have an FAQ. So for any detailed questions you have about the data, we have an FAQ that you can download. And if you're ever confused about how to operate the site, we have a user guide, which you can select here, and it will provide you information with how to operate the site. At the top, we have our partner recognition tab. So if you're ever curious about who supported us on this project, you're able to go there and click on their particular websites. We also have additional information around not only the data FAQ, but the methodology for our ranking method for the rental index, as well as a link to see our 2011 data. So this provides a link to the previous iteration of the rental housing index. We were originally going to include a function to compare between 2011 and 2016. But in our consultations with StatsCan, they advised against such comparisons due to different methodological approaches for the 2011 NHS and the 2016 census. So we do have the data available, it's just not directly comparable between the two. So I think with that, I'm going to pause and just take some questions right now.
Hi, Brian. Thanks for that. Yeah, as Brian said, if anyone has questions, if you could type them into the question dialog box on your GoToWebinar control panel, we can take some now. But if you think of a question while Brian is going through the rest of his presentation, do not hesitate to ask, because we can always go back to the previous sections of the presentation. So there's one comment so far, Brian, in the question dialog box, and it's just to let you know that this is a fabulous resource, especially the download and share visual option. Someone commented on that and basically saying thank
fantastic.
you. And I wanted to echo that as well, just because I think for advocacy work in particular, and I know you mentioned this, I think this is a absolutely fantastic tool that I know CHRA we've used in the past, and I've used it in previous positions as well, because I've heard Brian speak about the rental housing index back in 2016. So this is like a part 2 for me. But I know that for us, for CHRA, we'll definitely be using the tool, looking to use the tool for our advocacy components for our federal election campaign, for the 2019 federal election campaign. So I know Brian's going to go into a little bit more as to how the tool has been used. I don't see any other questions coming up right now. I think maybe people are thinking, and when they think of a couple of questions, they can ask, and we can always go back to them.
Yeah, no problem. And maybe what I'll do, I think we're going to have a bit more extra time here. I can just click on the 2011 data, and you can just see the old version.
Yes, yeah.
Takes a little while to load. But there is some additional information. I'll be talking a little bit about some of the updates that we have planned. This iteration, because it's based on the 2011 data, we have more data within this one. So you can go and use that as a resource. Okay, so I'm going to go back into my presentation here. Oh, shoot.
Well, as you go back, we do have a question.
Oh, great.
Oh, and the question actually goes into the next part of your presentation. So the question is, are there examples of how this has been used, projects and impact, and what the impact has been? So that's a perfect segue, I think, into part 2.
Yes, that's fantastic.
And there's yeah, go ahead.
No, sorry, go ahead.
No, the next question I'll ask towards the end of the presentation, no worries.
Okay, sounds great. So I just want to spend a few minutes to discuss where we're seeing the CRHI used in practice. And so in the first instance, it's being used quite extensively in the media. And so this is data taken from a software that we have to track media coverage called Meltwater. But since the launch in 2018, we've had 143 unique media outlets cite the index. That's created 219 stories, and we've had about 25,000 Facebook and Twitter shares since that time. And, it's not, just the big outlets that are kind of reporting on this. We're seeing, on a weekly basis, a lot of small newspapers from around the country in communities like Cowichan or Simcoe or, around the country, providing information from the rental housing index to inform stories. And we really think that this is helping to inform the debate on rental housing. And we noticed a real shift in BC that after we released the index, it kind of changed the conversation a little bit, or at least contributed to the changing of conversation, to not just focus on ownership and the problems that we're facing, first-time home buyers and things like that, but to really focus on the plight of renters and low-income renters in Canada and BC. So I'm going to go through just a few examples rather, of different plans that this has been used in. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the New Commons development. This is a more recent guide that was just released. I'll talk a little bit about how it's being implemented in the City of North Vancouver's Housing Action Plan. and then look at a bit of an older example of a renter affordability profile that used the rental index data quite extensively. So let me just pull these up right now. So this is a bit of a newer project, the Community Developers Toolkit by New Commons Development. They're a nonprofit kind of coalition of developers. And this is a resource guide for developing community-based assets. So one of the first things you can see is that in developing a needs assessment, for instance, the index can be used as a resource for understanding need within particular communities. And so this kind of points out, just what you can kind of find in the index and how it can be used to inform affordable housing planning in the initial stages of a development. As I mentioned, this is the City of North Vancouver's Housing Action Plan. So they kind of have a strategy around family-friendly housing in their strategy, and they use rental index to measure, how many bedrooms are needed for families. So you can see that the index is used here. Approximately 1,500 households in the city are living in housing that's too small for their housing size and composition, and at least 2,035 more bedrooms are needed to house all city renters suitably. So, we see a lot of reports and housing action plans and municipal strategies that have been bringing in the index data. And that's really encouraging to see. That's exactly what we want to see. And, it's really important for us that smaller municipalities that might not have the capacity to undertake, custom data requests and to go through the process of developing their own housing needs assessment to really use the index data in their own action plans and for their own planning purposes. And then finally, there's a lot of advocacy material out there. This is from the County of Simcoe and from the Social and Community Services Department. It's based on the previous iteration of the index. But you can see that it's just kind of a nice infographic showing, the different aspects of the index data, the average housing costs, your overcrowded conditions, what renter households are paying for rent, and then a comparison between kind of Canada, Ontario, and Simcoe. So you can kind of understand the different housing needs within the community. So I only pulled out 3 here. There are many more, reports and things that we've seen this in, but I just wanted to kind of quickly highlight that. And to go to kind of my final slide here before we jump into some more questions here, I just want to talk a little bit about some of the planned updates we have for the index. So this November, we're going to be putting in information for Indigenous households and immigrant households. So you're going to be able to see, for instance, immigrant households by period of landing, whether that's 10 years, below 5 years, or 5 to 10 years. We're also going to put in information around family types. So you're going to be able to see, information for single mothers, for couple family households with kids, and different sorts of family types that are derived from the census. So look for that update that will be released at Housing Central this November. And then moving forward into the federal election, a really popular function that we had with the previous iteration of the index was to have our federal electoral districts as a geography that you could select. So we found that this was really helpful for community groups that were meeting with their MP. They could just go to the index, get all the information for the particular riding, and then bring that to the meeting with their elected official and provide an overview of the situation there. So that's something that we are planning for next year. So kind of leading up to the federal election, we'll be developing that update of putting in the federal electoral districts. I should note too that with the index data right now, we provided a bit of a cutoff where it only measures households with with more than 500 renter households and a population greater than 4,000. So the reason why we did that is just for data reliability issues. But we do have access to a lot of the data. So if you see that your community is not represented in the current iteration of the index, email the research department. We have a contact information on the top right of the site. I'll just point you to that right now. Just research at BCNPHA. And you can request data for your particular community, and we'll probably have it, even though it's maybe not displayed within the this index. Okay, so I think that's it for me. So I was hoping we could maybe jump into some questions now.
For sure. Thanks, Brian. As Brian said, if you do have questions, please type them into the question dialog box as we're addressing the questions that are already in there. We have some good chunk of time, so if you do have questions, we'll definitely get to them. So Brian, I'm going to go back to, I have one comment and a couple of questions. So I'm going to go back to the question that was asked of the previous section, but it relates to the index as a whole. So the question was, is there any information on how the index was developed available on the website?
There is not any information with how it's developed. But I'm more than happy to provide information if somebody has any questions about that. You know, you can just email me, and I'm able to provide you with any background information with the specifics of how we went developing it. But essentially, it was a process of going through, and you know, we ordered a custom data request from Statistics Canada that had all of our variables that we wanted. And then it was a process of working with our fabulous IT department to kind of port it into the new Tableau software. So there were some growing pains with that, but you know, we managed to really make a product that I think we're all proud of here at BCNPHA.
Great, thank you. The next is a comment, and it's just from one of our participants who's saying that they've used this information on board reports and business plans before, and it has proven to be very useful. So they've used the index to inform their board reports and business plans. So that's a comment. And then the next question for you is, so is there any data being captured on the growing need for accessible housing in the country?
You know, that's a great question. We do not have anything derived from the census on that. We would be open to putting in new sources of data if they were provided to us. So, you know, one thing we've had discussions about are including the CMHC's data around vacancy rates for the purpose-built stock. You know, that's something that we're able to put into the index. In terms of accessible housing, we don't have any solid information from the census itself. So we would have to look at other sources of data to put that in.
Thank you. So I again encourage everyone who has questions to type them in. This is the best opportunity to ask Brian, although he did say that he'll share his email. But if you do have questions, please type them into the question dialog box right now. So I have a question, Brian, and I think you partly answered it, and you might have fully answered it, but I might have just missed. So for the federal electoral districts that you're looking at adding for next year, for prior to the election, you did mention that the same sort of overview of the rental housing situation will be available for those electoral districts. Will there be the same capacity to create the infographics for those federal electoral districts?
Yeah, essentially all the information will be in there. So you're able to do the infographics. You'll be able to do comparisons between different federal electoral districts. You'll also be able to go through all the different indicators, the data tables and maps. And pull in that information for the federal electoral districts. It's another thing too, we are looking into this, but potentially putting in provincial electoral districts. That's going to be on a as needed basis, but it's definitely something that we do have capacity to do.
Great, thank you. The next question is, it's specific to the income quartiles or quarters that you have.
Yeah.
So how are the ranges determined?
The ranges are determined through Statistics Canada providing us the data. So essentially what it does is it breaks out each individual survey respondent is put into 4 equal categories. And because you're marking it down on a survey, you're able to group the different income categories. So each household will have a record of how much income they have, and that is how it is determined. So for the purposes of our data, we filter out households with an income that have an income less than 0. So all of the households presented in the index are households with an income greater than 0. So there are households that live on credit, on savings, and those are not included.
Okay, thank you. The next question is, and please correct me if I'm wrong with the acronyms in this question to the person who's asking it. So there's a difference between number of income assistance and I believe PWD would be people with disability. Yeah. And nonprofits and the number of purpose built. So there's a difference between number of income assistance and people with disabilities and nonprofits and the number of purpose built, but we don't know where people live. Where do people with disabilities live? How many on flat rate RGI and how many in low end market rent and how many in market rent? So basically she's asking, how can that be done? Can we do that?
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, it's something that unfortunately would be very difficult to derive from the census data. And so therefore we would have to, again, pull this in from other sources of survey data. But with the current setup of the census, it would be very difficult to kind of arrive at, you know, what households on PWD or income assistance, because those are provincially administered programs, are in particular segments of the purpose-built rental market or in RGI housing. It's just the nature of kind of how the questions are asked within the census data. And so, again, the answer to the question is that you'd have to pull in other forms of data from provincial sources.
Okay. So if any participants have any suggestions for you in terms of provincial data that is available but might not be, you know, widely known about, could they email you, and what email should they be using, or do you want me to share?
So anything can be sent to just the research email there, and we are happy to take a look at those sources of data.
Great. Okay. I will. Well, okay, so if anyone else has questions, please type them in. We have a couple more minutes. Brian, I want to thank you for taking the time to present on this topic. I think it's very important and very informative and a fantastic tool that exists for our sector and other related sectors as well. Do you have anything that you'd like to add before I do my closing spiel?
Well, I think just look forward to the updates in November. We'll be pushing that out through social media. It'll be all based around our conference, the Housing Central Conference. So if you're coming to that, look forward to the announcement, and otherwise stay tuned on social media. Great.
So many thanks from all of us here at CHRA, to the audience for participating, and to Brian for presenting. Today's webinar recording will be shared on CHRA's website in the coming days. There will also be a survey emailed to you following the webinar. These surveys help us here at CHRA with future webinar programming and we greatly appreciate your participation. There's also going to be a couple of questions around the rental housing index and either your past use or whether you foresee using it in the future. So I'd like to thank everybody. There's one last comment that also thanks everybody and says that they really appreciated this session. Thank you for the opportunity, and that they have used the index in the past, focusing on the community profile. Now they know how to use the other sections. So
great.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you to the audience, and enjoy the last days of summer.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.